Check one, check two, check three. All right, excellent. Yeah, save you guys me shouting at you. So my name's Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep on Twitter, and I have a confession to make to you guys. I am an incredibly, impressively lazy person, and I'll get to that in a minute. What I wanted to do today, actually, was tell you a quick story about a tree. Now, this tree is actually located in the Pando Forest, and this is in Utah in the United States. And it's a fairly impressive size. It's around 43 hectares, fairly large, not too overbearing. And as you're walking through this forest looking for the tree, you'll actually learn something, which is that I just lied to you. This is not actually a forest, but actually just one tree that you're walking through. You see, Pando is actually the Latin term for eye spread. And so it's basically not a forest, but what's known as a clonal colony. It's basically one giant quaking aspen tree. So each trunk that you and I perceive with our eyes is actually just a stem, each growing out of this massive underground root system that they all share. And there are some 40,000 stems in Pando. And Pando is actually estimated to be some 80,000 years old, although there are some scientists that say its age might be closer to 1 million, which basically makes Pando one of the largest and also one of the biggest organisms on the planet. This is a talk about web design. I'm telling you guys this story because I think in recent years we've started to realize web design's forest for its trees, that we've been moving further and further away from this notion of this page, right? That there's this abstract framework that houses our design, and we just sort of populate it with things, filling those columns and rows with meaningful information. And instead, our design work has started more and more at the smallest level of our designs, from the content, from the individual pieces of our interface, and built out from there. Trent Walton wrote this wonderful essay a few years ago where he's talking about his transition from something of a responsive design skeptic, in his words, into somebody who I would say is doing some of the most beautiful responsive design work out there. And he talks about how he traded the control he had in Photoshop for a new kind of control, not less, but a new kind of control, using flexible grids, fluid images, and media queries to build not a page, but a network of content that can be rearranged at any screen size to best convey a message. I love that image. It's really, really beautiful. Because I think, just writ large, that's kind of what's been happening to our industry over the last couple of years. It feels really weird to be the guy talking about responsive design a couple years on, because I just wrote an article. And it's been really amazing to see people reinvest in this notion of building from the bottom up, building from the smallest, most infinitesimal pieces of our design, these more nimble designs that can be rearranged at any screen size. And it's been happening across nearly every industry, too, and this is the really terrifying part for me. This is really bad for my imposter syndrome. People basically using flexible grids and media queries to rearrange these smallest pieces of our design to basically build these really wonderful, really nimble interfaces that can be rearranged and actually communicate something, that can tell a story at any screen size or any viewport size to best convey a message, to best tell a story. But here's the thing. On the web, we kind of have a tough job. I mean, I love showing up for work every day, but still, it's got its challenges, right? I mean, because I'm usually starting my day looking at a pile of devices, something like this. This is why I drink. One of the reasons, anyway. But it's not just about the individual form factors, right? I mean, we're dealing with more operating systems than ever before. We're dealing with more input modes and devices that aren't purely touch or purely analog, but sometimes straddle both pretty effectively. We're dealing with displays of varying color density and degree. In other words, we're really at a point now where the words we use to refer to these devices most broadly, tablet and mobile, are just so broad and so inaccurate as to be completely unhelpful in addressing the complexity of what we're trying to design on a daily basis and of the compelling interfaces we're trying to bring to our audiences. And the problems just seem to be compounding themselves, right? I mean, we're dealing with new device classes hitting the marketplace and new browsing contexts that we didn't previously account for. As well as new interaction models that are being experimented with by software and hardware manufacturers, things that we hadn't considered before when we start thinking about designing these hierarchies for screens. The network that we use to deliver our content, deliver our information to our users, is far more broadly accessed today than at any other point in the web's history. But it's also far more fragile and far more volatile than we might like to think, or maybe we like to admit on a daily basis. So I don't know about you guys, but it's easy for me to basically look at all these different device classes we're designing for, all this innovation that's kind of happening on almost a weekly basis, and the fragility of the web that we're basically trying to deliver. And I gotta be honest with you guys, I just kind of react with a little bit of laziness, frankly. I get a little bit negative. I get a little bit sleepy, and frankly, I just want to kind of go back to bed. This is really a very frequent emotion for me. The thing about laziness, though, is we use a lot of adjectives in our daily talk, right? I mean, let's say you and I are having a conversation about a friend. I could describe that person as liberal or conservative, or a daydreamer, or incredibly logical. And depending on who you are and the values that you hold dear, I mean, any one of those words could be seen as either a complaint or a compliment. Everyone kind of agrees that laziness is not really that ambiguous. It's kind of like always seen as preventing you from achieving something, right? Either a life goal or something in a project. But I'd actually like to suggest that maybe a little bit of laziness isn't the worst response to some of the challenges that we face. There's this wonderful quote by Khalil Gibran, who basically said that our anxiety does not come from thinking about the future, but from wanting to control it. And I was rereading this quote as I was working on this talk, and it really kind of struck a chord with me, because I think that's absolutely true, at least for me. I see all these challenges as things that need to be managed, as challenges that need to be overcome. But maybe a little bit of laziness could actually be a bit of a strength, when we're dealing with all these complexities that we're trying to design for. And maybe laziness, intelligently applied to web design, could actually be a little bit of a virtue, maybe a bit of a saving grace. So this is kind of an open question, kind of a meandering meditation on laziness in responsive design, or at least laziness as it's been manifesting itself lately in my work, and how I've been trying to let go as I start thinking about specific components of a responsive design. So I thought I'd share a couple of these things with you guys, and maybe over drinks tonight we could have a little bit more of a conversation about the way that we work and design for these different challenges together. So with that, I'd like to start right up at the top with layout. And at least laziness in layout for me has been manifesting itself in really kind of one of two areas predominantly with my recent work. That is video and designing grids for responsive design. So when we're incorporating media into a responsive or flexible layout, I mean, there's a lot of finesse work that needs to happen, but at the foundation, the bare minimum thing that you need is this rule, image max width 100%. Which basically says that an image will never exceed the width of its containing element, and it'll resize proportionally as its fluid container sort of expands or collapses. And again, there's a lot more of finesse work you can do on top of this, but this is sort of the first step in the process. But the nice thing about this is this can sort of be extended to other kinds of media that we work with, embedded objects, video, what have you. This is a really quick example from my blog, which is neither responsive nor attractive. So this is a flexible video inside of a flexible grid. And so as I resize the column, you'll notice that the video's width changes accordingly, right? It never exceeds the width of its container. I've just realized this video is kind of terrifying without sound. I apologize. But the other problem here is that this is sort of suboptimal, right? I mean, the height of the video hasn't changed. And this is kind of a problem of scale, because the embedded media we work with in our designs doesn't necessarily have intrinsic dimensions, so we have to specify them in the markup. And we can easily override the width in our CSS, as we just did, but we can't easily do the same thing with height auto or something like that, because then we'd have a bunch of zero height videos and we'd all be fired. So there have been a lot of people sort of experimenting with this, which is kind of great. This is madebyhand.com, which is a beautiful responsive site about an even more beautiful film series. I can't recommend this enough. But as it's a film series and a responsive site, as you resize the browser window, you can actually watch the videos in a completely responsive layout. And the way that they're getting these videos to work in a flexible design is with a little bit of light JavaScript. It measures the video dimensions when it first renders into the page, and then as the video resizes itself, it's redrawing the video proportionally based on those initial measurements. This is dolectures.co.uk. This is an earlier version of the site. And they're taking a very similar approach. You can watch these conference videos in a completely responsive design. But in both of these examples, you'll notice that there's a slight visual stutter, that it takes a second for the video to kind of catch up as the design re-renders itself. And this is because, the resize event is actually very expensive to sample, so they've throttled it a little bit in their JavaScript. But this also kind of makes the case for, maybe JavaScript's not the ideal solution for this, and maybe we need a more native approach to resizing videos. Well, thankfully, this is kind of a solved problem. Back in 2009, Thierry Koblenz wrote this really wonderful article for Listapart on creating intrinsic ratios for videos in fluid layouts. This is in the days before responsive design. And his approach, I think, was actually kind of beautiful. So, if we look at any video in a page, any page whatsoever, responsive or not, we understand that it has certain dimensions, a width and a height. But if we move past the pixels, I mean, those two characteristics actually have a very deep and fundamental relationship with each other, which is specifically the aspect ratio, measured from one corner to its diagonal opposite. Well, the nice thing is that we can actually calculate that aspect ratio with a little bit of math, simply by dividing the height of the video against its width. So if we take the pixels that were originally in the design and actually divide the height against its width, we're left with an aspect ratio of about 56.25%, or 16 by 9 in cinema terms. So if we hold on to that number for a second and we basically put it in our back pocket, we can then go into our markup and let's say we're going to size the video down to make it small screen friendly by default. And then we're going to wrap it in some sort of containing element, like this div with a class of video box, just for example. Well, the nice thing is that once we have that container in place, we can go back to it and apply some simple styles to it. And according to Thierry's article, basically we apply a positioning context to it, like a position of relative, for example. And then we apply a padding top of 56.25%, the aspect ratio we calculated a few seconds ago. What that does is it basically creates a kind of ghost box at the top of our container, a padding that's always going to be 56.25% as tall as the box is wide. Let me give you a quick example. So I've gone into my inspector in the old Do Lectures design, and I completely removed the video from the page. I've applied a background color. The text that you see is actually just generated with CSS. So this is a completely empty block in our design. So as I resize the browser window, you're going to notice that that padding maintains that aspect ratio for me, even though there's absolutely no information, no content contained inside of that block. I think this is neat, but I don't get out much. But anyway, this is kind of just the stage, right? We're going to then basically go back to our CSS, and with that padding top in place, that aspect ratio shim at the top of that container, we're then just going to use simple absolute positioning to anchor the video at the top left corner of that container and set its width and height equal to 100% of the width and height of that flexible ratio-aware container. So this is the net result. I've gone back to the Do Lecture site. I've completely removed all the JavaScript entirely. And so basically this is the net result. With that simple padding top in place, we now have a video that's completely aspect ratio aware. It's always going to be stretched to basically over that flexible canvas to ensure that it maintains its shape no matter how wide or small that column ends up being. So this is, at least for me, kind of a wonderful example of what I think of when I think about laziness in design. It's a little bit less code, a little bit less effort maybe, but still the net result is the same. And in this case, it was actually better than a JavaScript-driven solution. So this kind of laziness in layout has been applied to a lot of other interfaces that I've worked on. Hayden was kind enough to mention editorially earlier, which is a responsive web application I worked on a while ago. And it's a beautiful interface, it's a beautiful product, and I'm going to miss it dearly. But it's a completely responsive web application. You can view it and work in it on any size screen, regardless of how wide or small your viewport might be. And because it's a responsive interface, it's built on a fluid grid. That's its foundation. And so there's been a lot of writing by myself and others about how you can take a grid that's been designed in pixels and turn it into something more proportional, taking target pixel widths from a comp and actually dividing them against the width of the container that they sit in, or their context. And once you do so, you're basically left with a number that, more often than not, is going to make you want to stab at your eyes because it's so incredibly awful. But rather than rounding it down, we can just drop it directly into our CSS and have the foundations for a flexible grid. The nice thing is we can apply this to other components of the grid as well. So for example, the gutters that were originally designed have a target pixel width, in this case 22 pixels. And they share a container with the element that those margins are applied to, that same context as before. And so simply by dividing the two widths against each other, we're again left with roughly 3% and a whole bunch of other awful looking numbers. But again, we can just take those that simple proportional math and plug the results into one CSS rule to have a fluid grid. Well, mostly, anyway. I feel bad sort of following Hayden because he did a much more beautiful job talking about effortless layout than I did. But I've been really leaning on andChild in general, especially for cleanup functions like this in code. So andChild, for example, is wonderful because we're going to directly address specific elements with, as Hayden said, without cluttering up our markup with meaningless cruft. So I could say, for example, andChild2 to address every doc cell that's a second child of its parent, and apply styles to it and it alone. But where things get powerful, as he showed earlier, is when I say something like 2n to directly address every even-numbered cell in the grid. Now this works because n is a counter. It starts from 0 and increments by 1 each time, so it's simple multiplication. 2 times 0, 2 times 1, and so on and so forth. So no matter how many elements happen to be in this grid at any one point, it could be 20, it could be 2,000, every even-numbered cell would have styles applied to it. That would be kind of pointless, at least in this layout. But the nice thing is that we can then basically extend andChild a little bit to say something like 3n to remove that right-hand margin we calculated earlier to ensure that every third cell is flush against the right-hand edge of the design. And then we can use 3n plus 1, the same logic that Hayden showed earlier, to basically start from 0 and increment by 1, but this time selecting every third cell starting from 1 rather than 0. And we can basically then ensure that that cell clears all the floats that precede it, to basically make sure that every row is a nice, tight, discrete group of 3 cells. And so anyway, with some simple proportional math and a little bit of light cleanup in the CSS, we have a completely fluid grid. So that as the viewport resizes itself, as the browser window reshapes, we have a grid that's defined in proportions rather than pixels. But this is, of course, just kind of the foundation. And this is where media queries come in. On top of a flexible layout, they allow us to articulate how these flexible designs should reshape themselves depending on the amount of viewport available to them. And they're great for both minor and major changes to the design. But every responsive layout I've worked on in the last couple of years has started with this sort of small screen-friendly baseline that doesn't actually have a lot of layout rules associated with it by default. And then from this foundation, we can basically look for opportunities to kind of enhance the design on either kind of a small or major scale as things sort of change and reshape. So for example, as things get a little bit wider, we could say min-width 31 ems to move to a 2-column layout. And we're going to do so with andChild 2n and 2n plus 1. And then we're going to repeat the process. So as things get a little bit wider, around 44 ems, we're then going to move to a 3-column layout and using 3n and 3n plus 1 as we just did before. So I think you can see where this is going. As things get a little bit wider still, we can move to a 4-column layout and so on and so forth. But basically, we're only kind of constrained here because we haven't touched the markup. We're only kind of constrained by the amount of time and resources and imagination we want to spend on this. We can design grid systems that are effectively infinite. Which is kind of exciting for me because, in my mind, responsive design is not about starting with a widescreen-friendly design and then articulating how it's going to be made accessible to smaller screens. It's really about thinking about your design as existing at any one point on a potentially infinite scale of resolutions. And a lot of really fun exploration and design challenges can kind of come up when you start thinking about letting go of the markup and start exploring some of these possibilities in CSS. Which, at least in my mind, brings up an opportune time to talk about the F word for a second. I'm going to keep it clean. This is about frameworks. Hayden made some really wonderful points earlier, but the one thing I did want to say is that I do think frameworks are wonderful resources for people learning the fundamentals of page layout for the first time, or for people that are trying to get acquainted with responsive design in general. I think these are wonderful entry points in general. They're great tools for learning. I use them in my practice pretty frequently, especially for prototyping, to create disposable designs, basically, to communicate responsive design patterns to clients without investing too much time in actually sketching in proper production-ready code. But the challenge with this is that I think that these are incredibly heavy. And I don't mean heavy from a code standpoint with the amount of bloat that's required in the markup, although that could definitely be a concern. I mean, they're kind of conceptually heavy. They're too prescriptive, they're too rigid. I mean, they're still very much focused on, on this idea of a page, on starting from an ideal layout and then articulating how it's going to adapt to different size screens. That there's no ideal version of the design, I think, in a responsive layout. Definitely not a 12-column one. And so I think moving past this might give us a little bit more flexibility. So I've been wondering if there's maybe a healthier model for frameworks in general. Because in my mind, I've been reading a lot recently about the beginnings of modern animation as an art form. And at the very early years, we had people like Winsor McKay and Max Fleischer who were really at the forefront of defining what animation could be and what it did. And their work was technically brilliant. I mean, if you spend any amount of time, I think you'll quickly be wowed by what they did, especially with the limited resources they had. But the other thing, too, is that compared to a lot of the people who followed them, their work is, it's definitely of their time. It feels a little too mechanical. It's hard to actually empathize with what you see on the screen. It doesn't feel human. But they had a tough job, right? I mean, they were defining a medium basically as they worked. They didn't have the time to really explore, anything beyond that. And I think their work is really still incredibly breathtaking. But it wasn't until Walt Disney formed his studios a few years later that people really started to take animation seriously as an art form. Because Disney and his animators basically came up with these wonderfully simple but evocative drawings that maybe on paper didn't seem like much. Maybe they were a little too spare. But it's kind of hard to understate that what happened when they were colored and animated. They leapt off the page. They felt real. There's this wonderful quote by Mark Davis, who was one of the very early animators at Disney, who said that before Disney Studios, animation had been done before, but stories were never told. And I think he's right. And a lot of writing and research has been, sort of coming up as to why this was the case, why Disney was so new. And it wasn't because Walt Disney himself was an incredibly talented illustrator or designer. In fact, he wasn't, according to the people who worked for him, in fact. And their drawings that the studio produced weren't necessarily more technically competent than a lot of their competitors, but they felt human. And the reason that this happened was, again, because Disney knew what he wanted, and he was incredibly demanding of the people who worked for him. And what he always asked of them was for drawings that had a caricature of realism, as he called it, that they possessed the illusion of life. I think that's a really beautiful phrase. In fact, it's also the title of an incredibly beautiful book written by two men named Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, who were two of the earliest animators who worked for Disney. And they basically talked about the framework that they used internally to talk about whether or not their work was actually measuring up to that standard, whether it actually possessed that caricature of life. And so one of the cornerstones of the book is they defined the 12 basic principles of animation that they used internally, and that since then have actually kind of become the gold standard for talking about quality animation in general. And the 12 principles were really recently adapted in an animated form, so I thought I'd play you just a quick excerpt of this. It's available on Vimeo if you'd like to see the whole thing.
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear.
So as I said, this is a brief excerpt, and the whole video does a really beautiful job of actually taking these 12 principles of animation that are in The Illusion of Life and actually communicating them to the user. But these principles were basically a really handy tool set for the animators internally at Disney to talk about the quality of their work. Did a character have enough squash and stretch as it moved across the room to actually feel realistic? As it was about to take an action, perhaps throw something across a room, did its arm properly stage what was about to happen? So when I talk about principles here, I mean this was actually a framework, but not necessarily in the web sense as we think about it. This wasn't a checklist of items that the animators had to include in their work, but rather it was a philosophical framework, a shared vocabulary that they could use to actually evaluate their work as it was in production, to see what might need to be improved or refined as they continue to iterate on it. I think that this is the kind of framework I would love to see on the web, specifically about responsive design. Where we don't talk about the execution specifically, but we talk about the quality of the work and how well it feels on a given device, not just how well it happens to fit in the layout. Because we have a lot of challenges when we're thinking about articulating our designs and adapting them to different media, but I think we're also kidding ourselves maybe a little bit if we think that this is the first time that this has happened. The web isn't the first medium in which this has been a real challenge. Print has been actually doing this for decades. This is a very recent example. Last year, the Whitney Museum rebranded, and they came up with this beautifully spare and minimal logo that has a lot of motion to it. And it also has a lot of different applications. It can be incorporated with different images and different text. It can also be encountered in the everyday world in very physical contexts. And so you might look at all these different applications of it and sort of think that there's this incredibly complex algorithm or some very scared-looking man in a back room somewhere drawing all these logos furiously. But the thing is that the designers of the logo came up with a really elegant framework for a logo that had an infinite number of applications. And the way they described it was this. They're given a specific canvas, a specific piece of paper. There might be some fixed elements in the design that they had to incorporate. So given the amount of space available to them after that point, after they included the must-have items, they would divide that open space into 4 equal zones. And then from there, it's just a simple matter of connecting the dots from the top of one line to the bottom of the next, and so on, to create what they called the responsive W. And then they spent like 4 paragraphs talking about how this had nothing whatsoever to do with responsive design. But I think this is a beautiful example of designing a framework that's much less rigid, much more nimble. Karl Gerstner, who's a Swiss designer of the middle 20th century, spent a considerable amount of time thinking about how to design frameworks to make designers successful, and thinking about design systems in general. And he had this wonderful quote that instead of solutions for problems, designers should be building systems for solutions. For no problem is there an absolute solution. There is always a group of solutions, one of which is best under certain conditions. And I think for me, at least, moving away from this really prescriptive notion of frameworks is going to be incredibly valuable because we are designing, as Trent said earlier, these networks of content, or as I prefer to think about them, as these small layout systems. Each of them are more or less independent, kind of self-contained little pockets of design. And then we sort of rearrange them to tell a story on a grander view. But they basically have their own needs and rules, sort of independent of the other ones that anchor around them. One quick example from editorially would be the masthead. So if you encountered this on sort of a widescreen display, it looks like a fairly traditional toolbar with functionality on the left and the right and some key text in the middle. But that's just one view of this particular small layout system, because below a certain point, it dramatically simplifies itself. The functionality hasn't changed, but it's condensed down to a series of links, each of which reveal more functionality when you tap or click on them, and some of them take over the entire view. So from a responsive design standpoint, the way we started with this, it actually did kind of start at that widescreen version. So we had to think about how to actually sort this into a group of shared buckets, key tasks that could be grouped together and then repositioned around the design. And once we did that, once we had this sort of small screen version of the design ready, we could then use simple absolute positioning to sort of move those buckets of functionality around the design with a simple media query. So above 50 ems, above a viewport width of 50 ems, we could basically take those elements and shunt them off to the left and the right-hand side of the design using Dreamweaver 1 version CSS. But it's not just about moving things around. We can also look for opportunities to promote elements out of submenus to make them actually visible by default, again using simple positioning, to drape them over that wider toolbar once we have a little bit more room to do so. And so the net result is this sort of self-contained little design system, this little sort of pocket of information that kind of adapts based on its own needs. In fact, one of the questions I often get is, well, one of the first questions I usually get is like, oh God, how did you code this, or why? But where do breakpoints come from? Where does that 50 ems come from? Well, that's actually driven by the needs of this particular layout system, because below that point, below that breakpoint, that central piece of text inside the toolbar starts to get in danger of being clipped by the elements on the left and the right. So that makes a natural breakpoint to sort of fall into that more simplified version. In other words, I really think that we should be designing media queries that aren't keyed for specific devices or specific resolutions, but are really used to defend the integrity of our content, especially in these small layout systems, to articulate how to ensure that those small pockets of design are always pleasurable to read and to interact with, regardless of the size of the screen or the state of the media. And so focusing on these modules, I think, is incredibly powerful, but there are a lot of sort of challenges in general about working with them. I mean, navigation is one particular one where there's no sort of like single best standard. And I think that's probably a good thing, given the complexity of some of the design challenges we have there. But there are a number of different patterns kind of emerging for managing navigation in a responsive context. I'm sure you've seen many of these. This is 538.com, which has a beautiful responsive site. And at the widescreen version of the design, there's some fairly traditional tooltips, right? These expandable menus that tease the content in each one of those sections. But those are seen as widescreen-only enhancements, because below a certain point, the navigation is just keyed down to the primary elements beneath an expandable element. And then above a certain point, they're conditionally loaded into the design to sort of add a little bit of extra flavor when there's room to do so. This is Walmart.ca. They launched this at the end of last year. And again, their navigation is visible by default on wider screens, but below a certain point, they've adopted what's kind of referred to as the off-canvas pattern, right? That the navigation is sort of waiting in the wings off stage until the user invokes it, and then everything sort of slides into view and pushes the content off frame a little bit. This is a very common pattern. I'm sure you guys have probably built a dozen of these today. But, editorially is another really good example of this. They iterated on the masthead sometime after I wrapped up my commitment with them. And it's the same exact pattern. You expand an element to bring in more functionality from the left. And it's a really great way of sort of reducing the cognitive load for the user. So all this extra functionality that is probably valuable to them, but not necessarily initially, so can be sort of left off to the side and let the user opt into seeing it. So there are a number of different patterns like these that are kind of emerging from managing really complex navigation sets. But they do share one characteristic, which is this one specific element that the user uses to invoke it, which is colloquially referred to as the hamburger. I miss English sometimes. But the hamburger, anyway, is this wonderfully condensed icon. You know, it conveys a lot of information, and it's very easy to incorporate into our designs, whether with Unicode or SVG or what have you. But I did want to talk about the hamburger for a second, because I do wonder if maybe just generally speaking in our industry, maybe we have a little bit of a hamburger problem. And maybe we need to have a conversation about how valuable it is. Now, I have no data here to back this up, and I'm prepared to be wrong on all of these points, but you know, there's actually a lot of complexity behind this icon, and in fact, it actually has a significance and a meaning, because this 3-bar symbol is actually the Chinese trigram for sky, or heavens, which seems like a kind of an arbitrary choice for click this and our restaurant hours will be made available to you, but here we are. But anyway, maybe that's not a big deal, right? I mean, you know, we can appropriate symbols. I think that's potentially fine. But I do wonder if maybe there's some suggestions out there that maybe the symbol isn't as clear to our readers and to our users as maybe we want it to be. This is Time.com, which recently launched a really beautiful responsive design. It's one of my favorites out there, actually. But they actually made a decision to make the hamburger ubiquitous. It's accessible to every user on any size screen. The interesting thing, though, is when you first encounter the design, your first load of the page ever, this helpful menu text pops up to tell you what this actually does. And in fact, if you mouse over this hamburger, which also has the text menu next to it, a little title pops up to basically say, click to show site navigation. So we basically have 3 extra levels of help text around this one simple item, which, and again, I don't work at Time, I'm not familiar with this redesign, but this suggests to me that potentially the hamburger wasn't performing well in usability testing. I just said that sentence out loud, and I hate myself now. But anyway, this is all to basically suggest that, you know, maybe we need to be just a little bit more diligent in testing these symbols before we adopt them, because it's an established pattern, and it's a beautiful one. Maybe there are some potential challenges there. The other one is, I think, a little bit more problematic, not with the hamburger itself, but with this, some of our patterns for managing navigation and responsive design. So this is Disney.com. They have a really beautiful responsive layout. I highly recommend checking it out. But they also have a hamburger. So you know, the user can sort of invoke the menu, and it comes in from off-canvas. And in that menu, you will find every single link that's ever been created on the internet. It's pretty much all there. If you guys were looking for that GeoCities page you designed 12 years ago, it might be in this menu. But I don't mean to criticize Disney. As I said, this is a really beautiful responsive site. But I do worry that the ability to conceal navigation might be avoiding some difficult questions sometimes. You know, maybe we're presenting these beautifully tailored, sort of minimal designs that are neatly ordered by default. And then the user opens the closet door, they click on the hamburger, and then we basically reveal all the information we didn't really want to deal with in the rest of the redesign. Anyway, this is all to basically suggest that, you know, I think that the ability to conceal navigation, to conceal extra functionality is incredibly powerful. But I do worry that, you know, maybe we're using it to avoid some of those hard discussions. I mean, if we really are designing for mobile first, if something doesn't feel at home on that smaller screen, yes, maybe we can conceal it. Maybe that's the best solution. But maybe we should have a discussion about how valuable it's going to be to any of our users if we feel that on the smallest screen it needs to be managed or hidden. Because there are some other patterns out there as well that actually are a little bit lazier and maybe a little bit more productive. You know, just adapting the layout can be incredibly powerful, I think. Filament Group just did a responsive refresh on their site, which is very open and very minimal and very beautiful. But on the home page, the navigation is actually treated as a first-class citizen, regardless of the size of your screen. So it's basically just styled in block-level elements by default, but then on interior pages, when the content is a bit more of a priority, they move to a toggle-driven element. So concealing it to basically place visual priority where it's due. And I really like this kind of hybrid approach. It doesn't need to be an all-or-nothing pattern across your site. Frank Camaro actually did a really beautiful job with his responsive redesign. It's one of my favorite responsive layouts out there right now. And the thing I like about it is that his navigation actually doesn't just fit. It feels at home on pretty much any size screen. And it's always visible. He doesn't hide it, he doesn't manage it, but it actually just feels proportional and right. Now, the thing that I like about it, too, is not just, you know, aesthetically, although that's a large part of it, but the way that he managed it, I would argue, is actually fairly lazy. Because on small screens by default, there's no multiple columns in the markup. He's basically using simple column count to reflow one single list, not multiple elements, within a specific container, to basically let the height of the element sort of dictate how the design should be presented. And then above a certain breakpoint, he can then basically move to column count of 5, simply adapting it to make better use of the available space. And I'm not going to presume to talk about Flexbox after sharing the stage with Tab, but he's doing this, I think, in a very beautiful way to get away from having to manage the position of the individual elements inside his masthead. And not that he'd ever want to do this necessarily, but if he did want to sort of change the position of those two elements, he could just simply change the flex direction. He doesn't need to manage those individual elements individually. He can sort of step back and manage it at the top level of that specific layout system. Anyway, this is all to basically say that, maybe we could look for opportunities to be a little bit lazy with some of these patterns, right? That just because we have navigation in our designs, and maybe it is very complex and deserves to be, maybe it doesn't always need to be managed. Because concealing our navigation can absolutely be incredibly useful, and I think it's incredibly powerful. But maybe it's worth asking the question if letting go of that impulse to manage it could potentially leave us open to fight bigger and better battles with some of the other challenges that we face. Because I know for me, at least, stepping away from having to manage these individual elements has been kind of fun, frankly, especially with some more interactive elements that I've had to work on. As a quick example, I'd like to tell you a quick story about a circle that I recently designed. Thank you. Days were spent on this circle, I can tell you that. No. Well, more specifically, this is a story about 4 circles and how they were incorporated into a design. Yes, thank you. Anyway, so I've been doing a lot of interactive work recently on a responsive web application in particular that's kind of built with progressive enhancement in mind because it's going to be deployed in a lot of developing markets. But we still wanted to have a lot of fun in the design, to actually communicate a sense of movement in the design, especially for people on higher-end browsers. So for certain elements, and this is kind of a representative mock-up, this isn't the exact interface, sadly. But anyway, we basically wanted to, for something as simple as a 4-across picker, where the user is, completing a transaction, we wanted to communicate the state change in kind of an interesting way, especially for something that might potentially be a little bit more dry in context and maybe kind of repetitive. So the layout for this was kind of predominantly existed in paper sketches, pretty much, for the first couple rounds of this. So what we sort of settled on was kind of this really 3-way design system. That when the user makes a selection, a number of things happen. That whatever they choose basically moves into the second position of 4. And then at the same time, we reveal a couple confirmation buttons to allow them to submit or back out of that transaction. And then all this happens with some really fancy animation and transition stuff. And after, again, sharing the stage with Anna and David, I'm not going to presume to know anything about this topic, but this was actually a really fun process for us. But the question that came up was, well, how do we begin with this? We settle on something that actually feels appropriate for this transaction, so how do we actually implement it? Well, for us, for me, at least in my practice, it always begins not with the interface. This is sort of the end goal that we're trying to move toward. It's more about the transaction that we're trying to support. Thinking about the markup that we need to provide to actually allow the user to complete the action, regardless of whether or not our CSS and JavaScript actually reach them. Because, for example, this is the end goal, right? So if the user doesn't support all the advanced code and interaction to actually make this happen, what are we actually trying to design for them? Well, since they're basically selecting a series of 4 elements, a simple set of radio buttons did the trick. Each one of them basically having an associated label which contained the text and the image. And then the confirmation buttons were simple form elements at the bottom of the form. So this looks maybe a little bit unsexy, has some light styling, but it's not especially interactive. But this is our foundation. And so what we can then do is in more enhanced environments, we can begin to layer on some of that additional fanciness, I guess. So the first step is to basically take those radio buttons and sort of excessively hide them. So the user is only ever really interacting with the label elements that contain everything. And then we can set the labels to display table cell and just ensure that they actually occupy roughly 25% of the available space. And then round off the different elements of our design, both the labels and the buttons that follow the form as well. And so this is just kind of the bare bones stuff. There's a little bit of extra styling, but that's kind of the foundational stuff to get this layout in place. We more or less have the shape of our final interface with just a couple light lines of CSS. And the buttons are obviously not in the ideal position. This isn't where we want them to end up. They're just basically stacked underneath the label elements themselves. But again, just as with the radio buttons, I mean, this is just another step in our design, another layer. This is the foundation for the next level of enhancement that we're about to build. And so when we do that, we do basically just a simple, light little JavaScript check to see if the browser is capable of more advanced animations. And if it is, then we append a class, modernizer style, to the document. And so that allows us to kind of qualify what needs to happen next to only the browsers that are capable of benefiting from it. And so what we do is then we move from this sort of stacked view into basically taking those confirmation buttons and actually positioning them up over the labels themselves, but only for just a second. Because what we then do is apply a scale transform to 0, and we basically sort of shrink them down and disable their opacity, and basically stack them underneath the label elements. So they're essentially shrunk down and hidden from view. But we actually want to reuse this scale and opacity transition for non-selected labels. And to do that, we basically work on the second part of the rule, which looks a little bit more complicated, but basically all we're saying in plain English is that for every, if our form has a class of selected, hide all the labels that don't have a class of checked. So basically, all the JavaScript has to do, it doesn't have to worry about managing the position of these elements or applying specific animations. All it needs to do is that when a user makes a selection, it applies a class of checked to that label. And then it also applies a class of selected to the parent form to basically communicate that there's been some sort of state change. And once we do that, we can basically then hide all the non-selected elements once the user's made a selection and scale them down out of view. These are kind of the building blocks, right? And then we can sort of layer on the transitions that we need to actually finish off this effect. And it looks kind of convoluted, but it's fairly straightforward. We're basically just simply setting a transform and opacity transitions on all the significant elements of our design. And then basically using andChild, just as before, to determine where we should translate those elements when they're selected to move them into that second position. And we're using translate x basically to move elements in units of 100%, basically relative to their width. So, for example, we understand that this second element is going to be the second position is the terminal one. When we select an element, we want it to move into that position. So 100% is a relative measurement that will move items from their default position into that second spot. So we can move the first element 100% on the x-axis into that second position, but the third element negative 100% to move it into that second one. And so this is really all we need to get this effect in place. So the JavaScript simply applies a class when selecting a radio button, and then those classes are also removed when we hit cancel. So we have a basic animation in place without needing to manage any of this in the JavaScript. We can simply use the structure of our document to power something that I think is a little bit more immersive and maybe a little bit more fun. But of course, we're not really talking about one interface, right? We're starting with semantic markup that's structured sensibly, and then enhancing up gradually into something that's much more immersive and much more robust. And I know what you're thinking, that I said at the beginning of the talk, that we should be looking for opportunities to be a little bit lazy. And in fact, maybe this is like 3 times the amount of work, and Ethan, you're just bad at your job, and this is an awful presentation, and I want to leave. But the thing is that a well-crafted design, responsive or otherwise, I think today especially needs to be device agnostic from the beginning. Trent Walton talked a lot about this in a recent article where he talked about how this is kind of a foundational principle for him and his responsive design work, especially as his studio is doing more of it. About how we're designing for browsers that are hostile to our design, for tiny screens, for slow connection speeds, and for touch inputs. And he basically talks about this process and how planning for that volatility from the outset can actually inform the design process and improve the product in the end. And he has this one wonderful quote, that like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. And I love that. Because, I mean, layout and adapting our layouts is really only the first step, and we have to plan for the volatility of the web. And I think the beautiful example of this would probably be the BBC News responsive redesign that's in public beta now and is about to become the default experience. And if you spend any amount of time on this responsive design, you're going to notice a whole host of UI niceties, like expandable menus, tabbed modules, secondary stories have images on the homepage. But this is just one view of the design. Because there's a baseline design that's delivered to everyone, that's eminently accessible. It still is responsive, but those expandable menus are just simple skip links that bring you to the bottom of the page. Those tabs are links to proper pages where the content resides in full. And those second stories don't actually have thumbnails associated with them. So basically, they're designing kind of 2 interfaces, right? A baseline foundational experience that's served to everyone, and then a more enhanced one that's served conditionally to the browsers that are capable of benefiting from it. And the way they talk about whether or not your browser is actually qualified to do it is this process that they call cutting the mustard. I love that phrase. But basically, they load only enough code to see if your browser can benefit from more code. And so that inline JavaScript, if your browser is sufficiently modern enough, then they bootstrap the application and give you a more enhanced experience. But this approach allows them to basically let go. They don't have to focus on individual devices or platforms and really think about managing them. Instead, they can design broad experience tiers. And I would argue that progressive enhancement isn't just critical to the BBC redesign, but also to modern web design in general, and definitely for responsive web design. In other words, I think this is possibly the laziest approach the BBC could have taken when designing this, and I would like to applaud them for it. So anyway, just a few things to wrap up. The web is obviously everywhere. It is every size, it is every when, it is accessible to any size screen, and this is kind of the modern challenge in front of us. We have to plan for the devices we know about, but also the ones that we don't. And I absolutely believe that established patterns and off-the-shelf frameworks are going to be incredibly vital to delivering those solutions and to figuring out how we deal with some of these complexities. But it's also worth remembering that maybe there are alternate approaches, and that maybe these are a snapshot of the web and the challenges that it has as we understand them today. There's this concept in Buddhism of the beginner's mind that basically suggests you should approach the world with questions rather than answers. Even when you're approaching something that you've already experienced before, you should try to disabuse yourself of any preconceptions or any previous experience, and always try to ask yourself how you would actually solve this if you were seeing it for the first time. To approach some of these challenges as though you're a beginner, with the eyes of a child. And at least for me, as I've been sitting in the audience today, I definitely feel like a beginner. I've been learning from people that have been talking about the future of layout, the future of animation, and also talking about how much fun we can actually have when we actually let go of design a little bit and actually really focus on the quality of our work and some of the intricacies of CSS. So I don't know about you, but I definitely feel inspired, and I definitely feel like a beginner. So I'd just like to suggest that maybe as we go forth out of this fantastic room in the heart of this beautiful city that I hope to visit again someday, maybe we should ask ourselves if some of these preconceived patterns could probably be the best solution before us, but maybe there's another more simple approach. Maybe we should let go of some of our ideas of managing the web and instead try to approach things with a beginner's mind. So I'd sort of suggest that you go forth and look for the lazy approach from time to time. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
We don't have much time,
All right.
So we'll do one question, if you don't mind,
No.
and then we're going to set up for the discussion.
Sounds great.
I think you've been involved in some discussions lately. I've seen some things going around online about what responsive design means now.
Okay.
You know what I'm getting at? When you first wrote about responsive design, you were talking about, the three
Right.
tenets or columns.
Ingredients or whatever.
Ingredients,
Yeah.
right? So immediate queries, flexible images, and fluid grids. How do you look at that now, a few years later?
Yeah. At least for me, I think there's been some discussion about whether or not the definition needs to be expanded, right? That, maybe it needs to encompass issues like performance. Like maybe design's not responsive if it's 2 megs in weight or something like that. Or maybe a responsive design isn't enough if it's, maybe it's a bunch of, generated markup in JavaScript or something. So it's inaccessible if it doesn't reach the client. For me, at least, I think keeping the ingredients for responsive design as open as they are, you just need flexible layouts and media queries to get them to work. For me, at least, sort of invites people to then sort of improve on that. Their first responsive design may not be front-end performance friendly, or maybe it needs to be refined from an accessibility standpoint. But I'd rather have at least people start the conversation about thinking about designing across different media and different devices, and then work on refining that from there. So for me, at least, I still think of those as kind of like foundational concepts, I guess, and then we can sort of build up and sort of have a better dialogue about building better responsive designs from there. So I don't know. Okay. Mildly jet lagged. I'm not sure I answered the question, but
yeah. You did. Thank you. And effectively, we've just hypnotized the audience with that thing right there. So
throw your wallets at the stage.
While you're in your state of trance, we're going to take 5 minutes and set up here for a panel discussion we'll have in a few minutes. Okay. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you, Stephen.